What would it take to bring a man like this to tears? A man who has preached to millions, a man who has counseled presidents, athletes, and broken families, a man who built a church from 10 people in a living room to a congregation that shook a nation. He has stood at that pulpit for nearly 50 years, unshaken, unbroken, unmovable. And then, on one Sunday morning, the giant fell, not because of a scandal someone else exposed, not because of a journalist with a recording, not because he was forced. He walked to that microphone himself, looked his congregation in the eye, and said words that no one in that building was prepared to hear. Today, we are going to walk through the full story of Pastor Tony Evans, the rise, the legacy, the family, the grief, and the moment that stunned the entire Christian world. And I promise you, by the end of this video, you will see this story very differently than the headlines told you. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we cover stories like this every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. To understand the weight of what happened on June 9th, 2024, you have to first understand who this man actually is. Because if you just heard the headline, "Pastor steps down," you might scroll past it. But this is not just any pastor. Anthony Tyrone Evans Sr. is, by almost every measure, one of the most influential Christian voices in the history of American ministry. Let that sink in. Not just modern Christianity, not just his generation. One of the most influential, period. His story begins not with fame, not with a large stage or a book deal or a television appearance. It begins with a 24-year-old seminary student studying at Dallas Theological Seminary, who gets a phone call that would change everything. A radio producer from Houston needed a preacher to fill airtime for a new broadcast. Someone recommended this young man named Tony Evans, and without fully knowing what it would become, he walked into a small campus recording studio and started preaching. That single radio appearance would eventually grow into a broadcast, heard in over 100 countries, on more than 1,000 radio stations worldwide. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before any of that, before the global reach, before the best-selling books, before the NFL chaplaincy, there was a small house in Dallas, Texas, and 10 faithful people sitting in a living room. In 1976, Tony Evans made a decision that defined the rest of his life. He founded Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship. No building, no budget, no guarantee, just faith, a handful of people, and a calling he refused to ignore. From that tiny beginning, Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship would grow into a thriving mega-church, a place of thousands, a community that would change Dallas, and eventually the nation. But his impact was not limited to Sunday mornings. In 1981, Evans established the Urban Alternative, a ministry organization designed to spread biblical teaching through media, radio, and community outreach. His late wife, Lois Evans, was a driving force behind its early growth. She personally managed the distribution of his sermon tapes, making sure that more people could access his teachings before the internet even existed. Think about that. Before social media, before YouTube, before podcasts, his message was already going around the world, one cassette tape at a time. And then came the books. Tony Evans would go on to make history as the first African American to publish a complete Bible commentary and a full study Bible. That is not a small achievement. That is a milestone in the history of American Christianity. He wasn't just a preacher. He was a scholar, a chaplain, a broadcaster, an author, a father, a husband, a mentor to future pastors. The Dallas Cowboys, the Dallas Mavericks, both had him as their team chaplain. He taught at the same seminary where he once sat as a student. By every measure, this was a man at the absolute peak of a half-century of faithful service, which is exactly why When that Sunday morning came, the world could not believe what it was watching. Now, before we get to that fateful Sunday, we need to talk about the Evans family, because you cannot understand Tony Evans without understanding the people around him. And at the very center of that world was his wife, Lois Evans. If Tony Evans was the voice that reached the world, Lois Evans was the foundation that made that voice possible. She was born in 1949, raised in a faith-centered home where integrity and devotion were not just talked about, they were lived. When she met Tony in her late teens, the connection between them was immediate. They were bound not just by attraction, but by a shared sense of purpose. They married in 1970, and what followed was nearly 50 years of partnership, building a church, raising 4 children, managing a global ministry, and doing it all while remaining grounded, humble, and committed to each other. Lois was not a background figure. She was deeply involved in the early days of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, organizing church activities, supporting outreach efforts, mentoring other women in faith, and contributing to the ministry through writing and music. She was, by every account, a cornerstone, not just of the Evans family, but of everything Tony Evans built. And then, in 2019, she was gone. After a battle with cancer, Lois Evans passed away, and the Christian world mourned, not just because she was a pastor's wife, but because she was Lois Evans, a woman who had shaped lives, encouraged hearts, and quietly influenced generations through her faithfulness. Her passing left a void that, by all accounts, was impossible to fill. But the legacy she and Tony built together lives on through 4 remarkable children who each found their own lane in ministry and life. Their eldest daughter, Crystal Hurst, became a speaker, author, and worship leader, using her platform to encourage women to walk boldly in their calling. Their second daughter, Priscilla Shearer, became one of the most recognized Bible teachers in the world, known for her ability to make Scripture feel personally relevant and deeply powerful. She even faced a frightening health scare of her own. Doctors discovered a concerning growth in her lung, requiring surgery, and through that season, she modeled what she had always preached, trusting God in the middle of the unknown. Their son, Anthony Evans Jr., took his gifts to music, appearing on a major national televised singing competition that gave him a platform millions would see. Though he didn't win, the doors that opened led him into a music career where he worked alongside well-known artists while staying rooted in his spiritual message. He has also spoken openly about the pressure of growing up in a ministry household, the weight of expectations, the private anxiety that others couldn't see. At one point, that pressure became so heavy that he stepped away from a live performance, unable to continue. It was a breaking point that eventually led to healing through counseling, faith, and finally, a renewed sense of who he was beyond his family's name. And then there is the youngest, Jonathan Evans. Before ministry, Jonathan played professional football in the NFL. That transition from athlete to pastor gave him a unique voice that resonates with young men, athletes, and anyone navigating identity and purpose. Today, he speaks to communities across the country, blending sports, faith, and real-world wisdom in a way few others can. This is the Evans family, not a perfect family, but a real one. A family that has experienced loss, pressure, public scrutiny, health crises, personal struggles, and kept moving forward. And it is against this backdrop, this history of resilience and faith, that the events of 2023 and 2024 must be understood. Because what came next was something even this family was not fully prepared for. It was September 2023. Nearly 4 years had passed since the loss of Lois Evans, 4 years of grief. 4 years of continuing to preach, to lead, to show up for a congregation even while carrying a private weight that few could fully understand. And then, at a church gathering originally meant to honor Lois's memory, something unexpected happened. The Evans family came onto the stage together. The atmosphere was reflective, emotional, tender. And then Pastor Tony Evans stepped to the microphone and announced his engagement to Dr. Carla Crummy. The room reacted. The congregation responded. And within hours, the news had spread far beyond the walls of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship. Now, to be clear, there is nothing wrong with a widower finding love again after years of grief. But in the world of ministry, where leaders are watched closely and where personal decisions carry public weight, moments like this rarely pass quietly. Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship responded with a statement of celebration. Describing the union as grounded in shared faith, shared purpose, and spiritual alignment, the couple held a private wedding ceremony, small, intimate, attended only by close family and friends. And for a brief moment, it seemed like a beautiful new chapter was beginning. But here is where the story takes a turn. Because while the world was processing the engagement, something else was unfolding behind closed doors. Something that would not stay behind closed doors for long. A Sunday morning at Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, the congregation gathered as they always did, expecting a sermon, expecting worship, expecting another powerful message from the man who had led them for nearly 50 years. What they got instead was something no one in that building will ever forget. Pastor Tony Evans stepped to the pulpit, and he began to speak. He talked about accountability. He talked about Scripture. He talked about the standards he had always taught others to uphold. And then, his voice breaking, he said something that silenced the room. He revealed that years earlier, he had fallen short of those very standards in his own personal life. He did not go into full detail. He was clear that no crime had been committed, but he acknowledged publicly, openly, before his own congregation, that his actions had not been consistent with the judgment he had always expected from himself and from those he led. And because of that, he announced that he would be stepping away from his pastoral responsibilities immediately, not a sabbatical, not a temporary break, a full step down from ministry, to enter what he called a season of restoration under church leadership. The church was stunned. The congregation, many of whom had sat under his teaching for decades, sat in shock. Within hours, the moment was everywhere: social media, Christian news outlets, national media. Pastor Tony Evans steps down, and the questions came flooding in. What happened? When did it happen? Who knew? Is the ministry over? The church released an official statement emphasizing that the decision had been made through prayer, counsel, and conversations with the church elders. They stressed that accountability applies to every leader, regardless of position, regardless of legacy, regardless of how long they have served. And they committed to walking with Pastor Evans through a process of restoration. Now, here is where I want you to pause with me for a second, because there is a version of this story that is easy to tell. The version where you focus only on the fall, where you make it all about the failure, where you reduce 50 years of faithful ministry to one announcement on one Sunday morning. That would be the easy version. But I do not think that is the honest version, because what Pastor Tony Evans did on that Sunday morning, walking to that microphone, owning his failure, not waiting to be exposed, is actually rare in ministry, very rare. And that deserves to be part of the conversation too. When a public figure falls, the world watches closely. But what often matters more is not how the public reacts, it is how the people closest to that person respond. And in the case of Tony Evans, the eyes of many turned to his children. What did the Evans family say? What did the kids think? His son, Jonathan Evans, addressed the situation from his own pulpit, speaking directly to his congregation about what had happened with his father. and what he said was significant. He clarified something important, something the original announcement had not made fully clear. Jonathan revealed that the family had been informed about the situation shortly before the public announcement, not long before, not well in advance. Essentially, the family learned what the congregation learned, and they were given only what had already been communicated publicly. There were no additional private details shared. That is a significant detail. It tells us that even within the Evans family, the full picture was not entirely clear. But here is what Jonathan Evans did not do. He did not attack his father. He did not abandon his faith. He did not walk away from the pulpit. Instead, he preached. He told his congregation that this was not an ending. It was a season, a temporary chapter in a longer story, one that he believed would end with restoration and return. He called on faith, not fear, on trust, not bitterness. That response says something about how the Evans family was raised. You do not build 4 children who respond to crisis with that kind of grace without having laid a very specific kind of foundation. And that foundation, by every account, was Lois Evans. Even in death, her influence was present in that moment. Her children did not crumble. They stood, not because they were pretending everything was fine, but because their faith had been tested before, through cancer, through loss, through personal pressure and public scrutiny, and it had held. Anthony Evans Jr. had already walked through his own breaking point, stepping away from a stage in the middle of a performance, crushed under the weight of anxiety and expectation. He came back from that. Priscilla Shearer had already faced a surgery that terrified her, not knowing what the doctors would find. She came back from that. Jonathan Evans had already made the transition from a football field to a pulpit, a journey that required letting go of one identity to embrace another. He came through that. And now, the patriarch of the family was entering his own season of testing. And the family, in the spirit of everything they had been through, chose to walk forward in faith, not blind faith, not performative faith, but the kind of faith that says, I do not have all the answers, but I trust the one who does. Let's talk about legacy, because when something like this happens, when a man who has built 50 years of ministry steps away, the world is quick to ask one question. Does the failure erase the legacy? I want to sit with that question for a moment, because it is not a simple one. Tony Evans preached accountability for decades. He taught it. He wrote about it. He counseled others through it. And when the moment came, when it was his turn to be accountable, he did not run. He did not deflect. He did not wait to be exposed and then spin the story. He stood at his own pulpit, in front of his own congregation, and said, I fell short, and I am stepping away to deal with that. That is not nothing. In a world where powerful men, in ministry, in politics, in business, rarely own their failures without being forced to, what Tony Evans did was actually uncommon. He chose accountability before exposure. Now, does that make what he did right? No. Does it mean there are no consequences? No. Does it heal every person who may have been hurt or confused or disappointed? No. But it does tell us something about the man. It tells us that after 50 years of preaching biblical truth, some of it actually got inside of him. And that is not something you can fake. The urban alternative, the ministry he founded, continues to operate. His radio broadcasts continue to reach over 100 countries. His books remain on shelves in homes, in churches around the world. His children are still preaching, still teaching, still leading. His congregation, the one that started in a living room with 10 people, is still there, still standing, still faithful. And as for Tony Evans himself, church leadership confirmed that the process of restoration is ongoing, and that the door to return is not closed. Jonathan Evans made it clear. This is a pause, not a period. Now, what happens next is not something any of us can predict. Restoration is not a quick process. It is not a press release. It is not a staged comeback moment. It is slow. It is painful. It is deeply personal. But if the history of this family tells us anything, it is that they have faced hard seasons before, and they have come through them with more grace than most people would expect, because that is what faith looks like when it is real, not perfect, not unshaken by doubt, but committed, enduring, willing to face the hard truth and walk through it rather than around it. There is something about this story that reaches beyond Tony Evans, beyond Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, beyond the Christian community that was shaken by this news. It reaches into something deeply human, because every single one of us, at some point in our lives, will face a moment where the standard we've held up for others gets tested in our own lives. Every single one of us will have a moment where we fall short of who we said we were. The question is not whether that moment comes. The question is, what do you do when it does? Do you hide? Do you minimize? Do you wait until you are forced to face it? Or do you do what Tony Evans did, walk to the microphone and say the words no one wants to say? I am not here to defend what he did. I don't know the full details. None of us do. But I am here to say there is a lesson in this story for every one of us. Accountability is not something you apply to other people. It is something you apply to yourself. First, that is the message he preached for 50 years. And in the end, he lived it. That is the full story of Pastor Tony Evans, the rise, the legacy, the family, the grief, the fall, and the faith that carried them all through. If this video meant something to you, if it made you think or reflect or see something differently, I want you to do something right now. Hit that like button. It takes literally 2 seconds, and it helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. If you are not subscribed yet, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, because every week we bring you stories like this, stories about real people, real faith, real failure, and real redemption. You do not want to miss the next one. And drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you most in this story? Do you think Tony Evans will return to ministry? Let me know. Let's talk about it. I'll see you in the next one.